Okay, so last week I started a message. It was just last week and tonight, 2 parts. And it was called Seasons of Change. And I opened with that familiar passage in Ecclesiastes where it says there's a time for everything. For everything, there's a season, a time for every activity under heaven. And so this week is part 2. And I'm just going to remind you of a couple key points that I shared last week that I will build on tonight. The first was remembering that change is always external. It's something that happens to you, good or bad. Like it could be traffic, it could be weather, it could be something that's happened in your body, something that happens globally. It's a situation that's kind of imposed on us by an outside circumstance or an unforeseen condition. But then there was this word transition. And transition is always internal. That's like the psychological piece. That's the mind issue that we have to integrate once this change happens. So some of us are frustrated by change because we're unwilling to endure this process of transition. That was a statement I made last year. That's a good one. Some of us are frustrated by change because we're unwilling to endure the process of transition. Sometimes we're just not good with processes in general because what does it mean? Time. So last week I placed a bit more emphasis on change. This week I'm going to focus on transition. Last week I stomped hard on a few toes. This week you can have your open-toed sandals on. You should be okay. I won't stomp on too many toes tonight. I hope to give you some tools to walk away with. So we talked about also that 34% of people right now identify as what we call nones, N-O-N-E-S, meaning no religious affiliation. And it's kind of like getting up and going to church on Sunday morning isn't such an integral part of our culture like it has been for so many years in our past. And so we're having to learn how, as individuals and as a church, to navigate and connect with people differently. We have to, be honest about the role that technology plays and how people connect and how people participate. And change is an important topic because it's our job to grow. It's our job to increase our influence. It's our job to innovate. And it's our job to reach the people that are lost. We need to change. And the good news is that change is a Bible principle and change is a God idea. I did read several scriptures last week in the Bible that basically support this idea of change. And we have to remember, guess what? God is always relevant. He's never behind the times. And so he's going to make sure we hang right there with him and give us what we need. But we have to be honest with ourselves and go, where do I stand with this whole change thing? And so I talked about some stages in how people adopt change. It looks like a bell curve. And there were the first 2.5% only of people that are like the innovators and like, let's come up with this idea, let's make this change happen. 2.5%, that's a pretty small percent. And then there were the people that were the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and then this group called the laggards. That was like 16% of people that are just like the very last to come on board with any change. And as I studied that topic, I started to think immediately about the Pharisees. And so I shared a bit last week about the Pharisees. They don't even qualify in the category of laggards. They don't even have a category because they just don't come on board with the change at all. And I read from Mark 7:13. And this is Jesus speaking to the Pharisees. And he says, and so you cancel the word of God in order to hand down your own tradition. That's probably one of my favorite things Jesus said to somebody in the Bible. I like that. Pharisees have always been representative of religion and tradition. 2 things that seem to get in the way of what Jesus wanted to accomplish when he was here on earth. It was like an established system that they didn't want to be altered. And so if you look at what did Jesus do when he was here on earth, he messed up their systems a lot. I went through a few examples that he denounced their authority. He touched lepers. You weren't supposed to do that. He healed on the Sabbath. That was a big no-no. He talked to a woman. And there were other examples of him, flipping over the tables in the temple. He ate with sinners. He didn't ritually wash his hands before eating, and he actually dared to forgive people's sins and bypass the temple sacrifices. This was like a big ruckus in those days. He caused a stir. He shook things up. He wanted change. And so we can do the same. And we should do the same. I shared a bit about some enemies of change. What are some things, maybe some behaviors that we have in our life that work against change? One of them was complacency. A second one was procrastination. And the third one was rigidity. Remember, I shared some stories about companies that maybe weren't willing to change. I had talked about like Kodak and some different companies that they were so rigid in their thinking that they basically made themselves die as a company. There were friends of change, being fervent and passionate, being proactive, and learning to be adaptable. So that's kind of my short review about what I shared last week, but of course, you can always catch up. I think Pastor Max still says you can go get the tape, but I would say just go ahead and go on YouTube. You'd probably find it quicker there. So tonight we're going to move into that psychological part of change, that internal response that we are having when things are happening around us. So this whole word of transition. And the quicker we can transition, the quicker the changes can be implemented and good things can happen. Most of us, I think, are in transition more often and more regularly and more routinely than we would realize or that we would like. It seems to be a constant factor in our life. So I generally, when I teach on a topic, I like to look up definitions of words and make sure we're kind of all on the same page. So I looked up just in the plain old dictionary, what is transition? And okay, hang on, I'll get to that in a moment. I'm going to go through the definitions. I'm going to give you some biblical examples of where we see it and hopefully give you some steps you can take to make transition a little bit easier in your life. And the part that we play is cooperating with that transition. And I like to say that transition is a skill. So that doesn't mean you're defective and you can never accomplish this. It's something that we just learn, and it's something that we grow with. Transition is a skill. We can get better at it. So it's defined as the process, there's that word again, the process or a period of changing from one state or condition to another. So as I said, I talked last week about fall being a transition that I didn't like, spring being a transition that I did like, and I started to do a bit more research on fall after I said that. And I, of course, remember the things we learned when we were kids around Thanksgiving and, the harvest. And it said one of the reasons that we have fall is it's preparation for a period of rest. We harvest, and then the trees shed their leaves, and then they rest for the winter season. I just thought that was interesting. That just kind of exploded on the inside of me. I'm like, this applies to us too. The end result of a transition is going to be rest when you get into that new season. The challenge is sticking with it through that transition until you reach the next season. I'm thinking about right now, I'm in this very small transition from Internet Explorer to Chrome. And I don't know what it is with me. I don't really love Chrome. And so now I'll open up websites, it's like, it's not gonna work, you need to download another browser, whatever it might be. And I'm usually not resistant to technological changes. And so I'm kind of like the people I shared about last week with the 3G phones. If you weren't here, I told a story about some people resisting. But I'm like, I don't want to lose all my bookmarks. I like how my bookmarks are organized in my Internet Explorer. And I don't want to learn to navigate new menus. And I'm focused on the things that I don't like instead of looking at the benefits of what this transition could give me. I literally was yelling at my computer screen this morning. I wanted to save a PDF document, and if you're in Internet Explorer, it's real easy. You just go File, Save As, and I'm in Chrome, and I'm like, where's the Save As? Where's the save? And there's no save, right? It says download. But the menu like only appears once you put your cursor over it. And so that's just like a really, really small example. This isn't even a major life transition. And so it just reminded me sometimes how anxiety producing and frustrating transitions can be. A friend of mine posted something on Facebook today. I didn't tell you I was going to talk about this. And it went just exactly with what I was sharing tonight, and I wanted to read it. It says, "It's not so much that we're afraid of change or so in love with the old ways, but it's that place between that we fear. It's like being between trapezes. It's Linus when his blanket is in the dryer. There's nothing to hold on to." Let's think about just some basic transitions many of us have experienced. And these are times in life that maybe can be a little challenging and rocky until we hit that next season. And they can be times maybe you felt like your blanket was in the dryer, just like Linus. So the first one I was thinking about was puberty. Who remembers puberty? It's like you're caught between the season of childhood and the season of adulthood. There's this part of you that, just still wants to be connected to mom and dad and be a kid. And then there's this other part of you wanting to live this independent life. Then you have all these crazy things, happening in your body. And so puberty can sometimes be a miserable period of transition, can it? Most people can remember that. Maybe the transition to independent living, the first time maybe you move out, whether it's in an apartment or a college dorm, that's a transition. Your mommy might not be doing laundry anymore, and now you've had to transition to life on ramen noodles instead of like meatloaf and mashed potatoes. So when you're transitioning from like the safety of living with, parents or adults and all of a sudden into independent living, there's a little bit of stress that goes along with that one too. Marriage is a transition. Would you agree? All the married people? Yeah. There's some people that have a really hard time surviving that first year of marriage, because we're in a season, in a sense, of only having to be concerned about your own self and needs, and now all of a sudden you have to be mindful of somebody else's needs and maybe what they want to watch on TV, and now you can't sleep on the bed like at a diagonal, or early marriage. Then parenting. That's, in my mind, the never-ending transition. Because just when you figure out one season, now they're in another season, and you figure that out, and then you're on to another kid, and none of the stuff that worked with the first kid works with the second kid or with the third kid. So when you're a parent, you're constantly in transition. And then there's that stage of life called retirement. And many people struggle with that transition in their minds because, well, what's my purpose? How should I spend my time? I'm leaving this season and structure of a season of structure and employment, and all of a sudden I'm going into the season maybe of less structure, maybe less money, less responsibility. All through our life, we can see different points that are transition. It's a part of life. Some of them you've experienced, some of them we have yet to experience. I remember my oldest child, and when she was younger, she really struggled in transition. When she was moving from like one structured environment to the other, and that was usually the car ride, like from home to school or school to home or wherever we were doing transition. Mental transition was happening usually in the car ride, and it took us a while to figure it out because she'd have like these behavior outbursts. You know what I'm talking about? Okay. And really, what we think it was just she was younger, and so they can't communicate some things. But like, it was just kind of that anxiety of the transition of like, okay, I just left the structure of school, and maybe I'm going home, and that's not quite the same type of structure. So a lot of us aren't different as adults, but we have enough self-control most of the time to not freak out. Well, maybe not. I shared earlier that dictionary definition of transition, but I also studied some of the Hebrew words for transition, and there were at least 3 of them. And all of them really can apply to this topic tonight. The first one, and I didn't try to figure out how to pronounce these, so I don't know if it really matters, but it was like ma'aver, apostrophe AVR, and that was to cross over or pass through, like a land or in a city. And I'm like, some transitions can be like that. They're just short, they're not too eventful, and you're just kind of taking a little path or a little bridge or a crossover. The next word was shinoi, S-H-I-N-U-I. If you are a Hebrew scholar, I apologize. It literally means to change. And the third word, it's spelled C-H-I-L-U-F, shiluf. That means to move on in the way that grasses sprout anew and the old sproutings have dried up and passed away. I feel like this represents some of the harder transitions that require moving on from something, and it has something that's passed away. Moving on is really necessary in transition, and I know that that is like easier said than done. Way easier said than done. I listened to a message by Rick Renner. I think most of you probably know who he is, and he told a story about when his family moved to Russia to start a church. And they started in this town or city called Riga. And he talked about how joyful it was, how awesome of an experience it was. They got there and they got the church going and they were loving it, and the church was growing and they were so excited, and just everything was going really well. It was successful. And so it was about a year or so into having the church that they had like a special service for a building dedication. And he said that he got up and he heard the Lord say to him, "Now I want you to give this church to your associates. I want you to move to Moscow, and I want you to do this all over again." And he basically said, "I did not cooperate." I'm just like, what? No. All over, move again to Moscow and do this all over again? He didn't cooperate. He says, "I disobeyed, and basically I tried to take yesterday's anointing and live in it today." And he goes, "And I ended up hating what I was doing every single day." He said the next 2 years were the most miserable times years of his ministry. He said he would show up to the building, he'd like sit on the steps, and he would just sit there and go, "I hate this place." It wasn't until he obeyed, accepted the change, and made that mental transition where he says, "Okay, I'm going to do this." He talked to his wife, "We're going to Moscow." Then came the rest. And he talked about this grace that came upon him for this transition. Thank God for grace, right? We are going to revisit how grace is offered in times of transition, but there's a few more things I want to share before we get there. I was reminded of something that I learned over the years. As a counselor, we're required to go 40 hours every 2 years for like continuing education. They want us to keep learning. Imagine that. And so I remember going to this one course. I don't even know what it was called. But they talked about you have 3 options in dealing with unwanted reality. And unwanted reality could either be something's happening that you don't want to be happening, or something's not happening that you want to be happening. That was their definition of unwanted reality. And that you have three options. One of the options is to mentally resist it. Do you get what that means? And they gave an example of like traffic. What happens when you're sitting in traffic? Do you feel that like frustration and you're like mentally resisting that you're actually in the traffic? And so they pretty much said, you can stay at this mental resistance for as long as you want. It does nothing except take years off of your life. The second option in an unwanted reality is investing effort to bring about change. So you can probably, once again, we'll go to the traffic example. You could go, okay, Google Maps, where should I go now? And you're like, I'm going to take this exit and go on this side street and go, and you like try to go a bunch of tricky different routes and side roads, hoping to avoid traffic and produce a different outcome. So sometimes when we're in a season of transition, we might try that. The third thing where we ultimately need to get is accepting it. Eventually, we have to accept this unwanted reality. That's when we've made that jump in our mind and we've transitioned to the truth of what's happening around us. I challenge you to pay attention to how much time you spend in stage one mentally resisting things and trying to remind yourself this isn't helping. So what does transition feel like? You can maybe just ask yourself that as you're sitting here. You know, let's be honest. You've maybe made this mental shift to accept something and enter into transition. And here I'm telling you there's going to be rest. There is rest that comes with obedience, but rest does not always mean an absence of challenges. I think sometimes we think, oh, I'm in rest, and you just really think it feels like you're on the beach laying out in the sun and life is good and there's nothing to worry about. That's not necessarily true. Rest, yeah, you know that the Lord is with you. You don't have to be fretful, but that doesn't mean there won't still be some challenges ahead. So one of the ways transition feels, I think it feels unstable. It's like you left Egypt, but you're not in Canaan. It feels foreign. It feels uncertain. You don't know what's to come next, what's going to happen next. You don't know what obstacles you're going to face, what giants are in this new land, or even if you'll make it to the next season. The Israelites, if we think about them, they didn't know where their food was going to come from. How's God going to take care of us? How are we going to get across the Red Sea? Are we even going to make it? Are we going to live? And so they left this very structured and controlled environment, even though it was slavery. It was structured and controlled, and they left that for this instability as God was trying to transition them into their promised land. And we know that they talked about wishing they were back in Egypt. And I think it's just because they were so uncomfortable in this instability. I don't know how many of you fish or go on boats. I don't go on boats very often, but think about like when you're trying to stand up in a boat or like a floating dock, or maybe if you're somebody who works out at the gym, you know what a Bosu is. And when you try to stand on it, you're going like this and your legs are shaking. It feels unstable. That's what transition can feel like. I think it also, a new routine feels wrong. When you start a new routine, it just feels wrong. Maybe you tried to change your routine and add in exercise. And you're like, I can't figure out how to fit this in. It's not working. Or maybe you've tried to change your sleep patterns. It feels weird. I think even this like 1 hour time change, it just feels so wrong. It messes me up every year. Does anybody else get messed up by like 1 hour? I'm like, I'm wide awake. It's 3:30 in the morning, you know? So trying to make a change with our sleep routines, they just feel wrong. It throws us off. You're like, this can't be right. I don't know about you, but when I get ready in the morning for the day, I have a certain routine in order that I do things. Even like when I'm in the shower, there's even a certain order of like when I wash my arms or my hair or whatever it might be. And so routines can be good, but when we try to change them, it seems really difficult and it seems really wrong. And so it makes us tempted to go back over here to what is familiar. And I think about Rick Renner, it's him going, I'm going to stay at that church in Riga because this is familiar, and going over here just feels kind of wrong. But if you remember, he said those were the most miserable 2 years of his ministry. Stephen Furtick said this, there's a certain kind of torture only found in transition. He says, you can see where you want to be, but you can't seem to get there. And so once again, I think about the children of Israel and that they're aware of this promised land. They're aware that there's this land and it's flowing with milk and honey. But they can't seem to see how they're going to get there. It's like year after year after year, they don't arrive. They don't get there. And so they let their minds lose focus on that promised land, and it got focused on everything else that didn't seem to be going right in their eyes. I know we talk a lot about them in messages about being complainers and grumblers. That transition portion for them was so hard that they wanted to go back to Egypt. They literally would have chosen slavery over transition. That's interesting. Last week I said our brains prefer a predictable amount of pain over uncertainty. And that's what was going on with them. They're like, at least in Egypt, we know what we're going to be dealing with. We know about this portion of slavery and how hard we're going to have to work. I can't deal with this uncertainty. Their transition time and arrival was undefined, and it resulted in them wanting to go back to a dead, miserable season in their life. We will face those same temptations when we are in tough transitions. Transition is also a place of vulnerability. I looked that word up, and it comes from the Latin word for wound. Vulnerability is the state of being open to injury or appearing as if you are. And so when we're caught between these different seasons in life and there's no known structure, it feels really vulnerable. Are you still here? Okay, good. We don't really know how to act. We don't know what to watch out for. If you look at the profession, or I guess it's called a profession, like security, like security guards, like security. They will say that it's places of transition that are the most vulnerable for attack. There's a lot of commotion, there's a lack of structure, there's plenty of movement, there's things that are just unpredictable, and so that's vulnerability. It's just a dangerous place sometimes when we're in transition, because who really likes to feel vulnerable? We don't want to be hurt. We don't want to let others know that we're feeling that way or feeling afraid or feeling unsure. So fear of this vulnerability is another reason that we might go, I think I'll go back to this season over here, because it sure feels uncomfortable over here being so vulnerable. Most of us don't like that feeling. So the question I'm answering here is, what does transition feel like? And I went through a couple that are a little bit scary, but another thing about transition is it's also a place of our biggest opportunity, because this is where transformation happens. We are forced to transform when we are in transition, right? We are forced to transform when we are in transition. Some of us have to be forced at times to change certain things in our lives. One of the biggest transitions for me started in 2014. If you've been around here long enough, you remembered Pastor Chris Callison, who was the founder of Living Free. And so he retired, and I was given the honor of being, the ministry head of Living Free upon his departure. And even though for years, I had thought about things I would like to do. Like someday if I'm in charge, I would like to do this. And, if I'm honest, I did have ideas of like, well, I think he should do this differently. And now all of a sudden the opportunity was here. And it was really kind of scary. And I'm like, oh my gosh, now my name is on the dotted line for everything. I'm the one held accountable if my counselors screw up. I'm held accountable for the success and the failure of this department. Then just about a month later, they share with me that they'd like to make me a pastor. And I was like, what? I'm like, God, you did not warn me about this. He had never spoken that to me. I never saw myself in the role of a pastor because I'm like, oh, I never went to Bible school. There's parts of the Bible that I don't understand. But I got through the transition, and I guess I can stand here today and go, I think I'm doing an okay job 5 years later. The ministry of Living Free was associated with this amazing testimony of Chris finding Jesus, getting sober from drugs and alcohol and completely changing his life. And now it was transitioning to some girl that was never addicted to drugs, that had very few bad girl stories, and has about half of his sense of humor. If you knew him, he could make you laugh. So I felt unstable. I felt like my routine was shaken up. I felt this sense of torture and for sure a sense of vulnerability. And not only did I have to take on this transition, but all that served in the ministry had to take on the transition too. And so he had made deep connections with a lot of people. I could never be like him. And I'm like, what am I going to do with this? And this is really where transformation had to happen in me. I had to mentally change if I was going to stay and if I was going to make it. So first change, I guess, that happened, or transformation, is I had to accept this role of pastor and believe that I had what it takes. I'm like, okay, God, if they see these things in me, like, I'm ready. I'm going to trust that you'll be here with me. I also had to remind myself that God didn't want me to be like Chris, but wanted me to be me. That I also had something to offer. I had to remind myself that I had 17 years of preparation, and now it was time for me to fly. I had been taught well. A lot had been imparted in me. I had to put my trust in God and not my skills, because this was new territory for me. This was a brand new season. So without this transition, and it was, once again, one of those things that was just put upon you externally. I couldn't control that he was choosing to retire. That was a change that happened. Without this transition, none of my transformation could have happened. I would have stayed in this place, and this place is called the comfort zone. Have you visited there before? Are you living there now? It's so easy to live in the comfort zone. So I'm encouraging you to take a little step out of there. I wanted to share with you 3 steps that I think can help with transition. I'm not saying there aren't more steps. This isn't an exhaustive list. I'm just sharing 3 things with you. I think that it can apply to transition in your personal life, in your professional life. It can apply to growth in your spiritual life, and it can also apply to changes happening like in the church around you. This church, the bigger church. The first step is called taking the leap of faith. And in the recovery world, there's something called the leap of faith. And it's like that transition period of taking the jump from the using lifestyle, drugs, alcohol, lying, manipulating, whatever, and like taking this leap of faith over here to the recovery lifestyle. And so that might mean leaving old friends over here and leaping into this place over here where you're like, I don't have any friends. I don't know any sober people. I don't know any Christians. It might mean leaving a structure and routine of addiction, which I know you might think, what structure and routine is there? But there is a structure and routine of addiction, and coming over to here and recovery and going, well, now what do I do all day long? I'm not trying to get drugs. I'm not trying to get money to get drugs. I'm not trying to hustle. I'm not trying to this. Well, what do I do with myself? So it's this big leap of faith. The transition is challenging because it's much more, I guess, tempting to go, at least I have some friends over here. They might not be doing the right thing, but it sure feels better than having 0 friends over here. It's no different when we accept Jesus, right? We take a leap of faith in many ways because we change how we lived in the world over here, and now we're trying to live this life over here that's pleasing to God. Oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, and that anymore. The hard part here, as I said earlier, is like we see where we want to be, but we can't seem to figure out how we're going to get there. I see this life of sobriety and Christianity and having, relationships that aren't so dramatic, but I don't really see how that's going to happen. How am I going to meet new friends? Like if I told you all right now, like next week or the next time I see you, I want you to have made 2 new friends. That's kind of hard, right? You don't just walk up to a stranger and go, will you be my friend? If somebody did that, you'd kind of be like, So this transition, this leap of faith is hard. I get that. But we need to do it. We need to remember that we can't grab onto something new when we have a death grip on what is behind. And so we have to let go of these old habits and these old excuses. Okay, say that. I'm ready to let it go. I'm ready to let it go. Should we sing it? Should I make you sing it? Let it go. I want to share a well-known verse. And I know when you hear this verse, you will tend to think of it in regards to letting past experiences go. But as I read it, I want you to look at it through a different lens, maybe in letting old methods go, old habits go, old ways of thinking go. Because if we really want change, part of that transition includes letting go of what's here and taking the leap on over here. So this is Philippians 3:12 through 14. This is from this one's from the Passion Translation, I think, yeah. And so think of it through that lens. It says, I admit that I haven't yet acquired the absolute fullness that I'm pursuing, but I run with passion into his abundance so that I may reach the purpose that Jesus Christ has called me to fulfill and wants me to discover. I don't depend on my own strength to accomplish this. However, I do have one compelling focus. I forget all of the past as I fasten my heart to the future instead. I run straight for the divine invitation of reaching the heavenly goal and gaining the victory prize through the anointing of Jesus. There are going to be situations in your life where you just have to take the leap of faith. It's one of those just do it. And as the verse said, it's a place where you don't depend on your own strengths, but you stay focused on what God has promised in your future. I love the part that says you fasten your heart to the future. And you have to remember God is right in the middle of the transition. You won't be able to figure it all out. It is going to feel uncomfortable. It is going to feel vulnerable. And your mindset will need to change. But you get to determine, am I going to go forward and take the leap, or am I going to stay stuck in this past place? Am I going to stay stuck in my excuses, my old ways of doing things, my old habits, in my comfort zone? It may require you to be honest with yourself and admit that there are things that you need to let go of because they're not serving you anymore. It could be thinking patterns. It could even be as hard as relationships. Are you staying in a relationship that's unhealthy basically because you fear being alone? Time to take the leap of faith. Are you staying in a job that you have no passion about because you're afraid of failing at something new? Guess what? Take the leap of faith. Are you hanging on to some old religious thinking because you're afraid of being uncomfortable? Take that leap of faith. Get outside your box. I think with change and transition, we can't overlook the topic of loss. When we take this leap, as the verse said, we're leaving old things behind. And sometimes they were things that we were very close to. Sometimes things we invested a lot in. Another story about my life, I guess, with living free. When I came on in 97, we were just licensed to serve adults 18 and up. And I was really passionate about youth and families, and I'm like, I would really like for us also to be able to help teenagers, young people. And so you had to do additional work to have a license to serve adolescents 13 and up. So there was like an application process with the state. There was like a long process. And I'm like, I'm gonna do this. And so I did that. And we got licensed in 99 then to serve adolescents. And so I started working with teenagers and young people for a period of time. And it was good, but we realized they had a lot more needs maybe than we were ready to offer at that time. We didn't have on-site school. We didn't have on-site family counselors or some things like that. And so that group kind of started to dwindle. And so 3 nights a week, I was spending my time maybe with like 4 or 5 kids. And then our adult groups maybe had more, like 10 or 12 people. And so Chris, said to me one day, he's just like, you're not going to work with adolescents anymore. I need you to work with adults. And so obviously from a business perspective, that made sense. I needed to invest my time where we had the need, and I just wasn't prepared for that. And guess what? That was like my baby. That was where I did all this work and for the state and wrote all these policies and procedures, and it was like I was so emotionally connected to that I couldn't see beyond that. And so I remember just feeling this sense of loss. He told me, and I remember I went in the bathroom and I probably cried for like 10, 15 minutes, and then I came back and I'm like, okay. And so it was necessary, but it was hard and it felt like loss. And I think there's things like that in our lives, whether it's we've been at a job for so many years, or we've served in a ministry for so many years, or whatever it might be, there's sometimes loss, and it might be one of the hardest parts of transition, and a lot of us don't do well with it. And so as a church, we have to be prepared that if we want things to grow, that means things need to be pruned and some things need to be left aside. And that means loss. Things that were and are important to you might look different. There might be a different leader, or they might just be things that don't go forward into the next couple years. It's hard because of what that thing meant to you, right? Just like that program meant so much to me, that we tend to let those personal feelings get in the way of what's better for the greater good. And that's where, Chris was at with me. We got to look at the greater good of the facility and where we have a need. I don't know, it was about a year, maybe 9 months ago, I participated in a training that was about discipleship, basically. How do you disciple somebody that comes into the church as like a visitor and walk them through the process of becoming born again, becoming a church member, that type of thing. And he talked about two different types of churchgoers. The first one he called consumers of church. And that's exactly what you would think. I come to church and I hear the word. I put my kids in kids ministry. I might even volunteer my time and maybe give a little money, but the main purpose is about what you get as a consumer of what the church offers. And so what happens with consumers of church is then when as a consumer they don't like a change that impacts them, they complain and they maybe even leave. Their motivation was self-focused and not other-focused. Does that make sense? Yeah. Like something happened outside their box that rocked their world. Once again, I feel like this is kind of like the Pharisees that I talked about last week. So there was the consumers of church, and then the other category he called were Christ followers. And he said Christ followers consume many of the same services, but they see their role as much more than that. They see their role as one who helps the church accomplish the mission of reaching the lost. So remember my example last week when I was saying like we had all this hubbub when we like updated the music and changed the stage like a little bit. It was like a big ruckus. So some consumers of church didn't like that and they left. A Christ follower will stay to support the change because of the bigger impact it has on the lost. They take up their cross and set aside their comfort, knowing that it might mean more people come into the kingdom. So we want to be Christ followers, and that may mean we have to take a leap of faith into a new change, and if that's what he asks us to do, then we're going to do it, right? It's normal for somebody maybe early on in Christianity or new to a church to fall in that category of consumer of church. But we would hope 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35 years later that you're not still in the category of consumer of church, that you've gotten to Christ follower. Yeah. So that was my first step. And good thing there's not 12 steps tonight. Are you excited? Just 3. So first was the leap of faith. The second step was accepting transitional grace. The story I mentioned earlier about Rick Renner was a story he told when he talked about something called transitional grace. And it was a term I had never heard of. Maybe it's new for you also. That was the first time I heard it a few years back. I want to read quickly from Galatians 2. This is 19 through 20 in the Message. I think it's 19 and 20. If you look in the Message, you know how it puts like 4 or 5 verses together. You don't quite know where it starts and stops, so I'm pretty sure this is close. It says, what actually took place is this. I tried keeping rules and working my head off to please God, and it didn't work. So I quit being a lawman so that I could be God's man. Christ's life showed me how and enabled me to do it. I identified myself completely with him. Indeed, I have been crucified with Christ. My ego is no longer central. It is no longer important that I appear righteous before you or have your good opinion, and I am no longer driven to impress God. Trying to walk out our plan by rules, laws, and strengths doesn't work. It's only in him and his grace and empowerment that it's possible to complete our call. And so Rick Renner shared that this transitional grace had 5 qualities. And the first one he said is that it's conditional, that grace is conditional to the call on your life. So for him, for example, his grace, what's his gifting? It's to start churches. Just like Paul in the Bible, he was an apostle and he needed to start a church, turn it over, move on, do it again, do it again, do it again. If Rick would have stayed in Riga, no other churches would have started. If Paul would have stayed in Corinth, no other churches would have started. I was thinking about in my line of work, turnover in the field of substance use is like high. Most people are in the field 2 years or less. And I believe that it's a calling and it has to be flooded with grace. I don't know any other way to say how you can stick with it for as long. But we have to cooperate and accept the grace. So I'm gifted maybe to teach and to counsel with people. There is no grace on me to run a worship ministry or to be a full-time missionary. I'll just tell you that. I wouldn't be very good at it. So the grace upon your life is conditional to the call that was given to you. So if you're trying to operate in somebody else's call or be like somebody else, the grace isn't going to be there to do it. So it's conditional. He said it's positional. Many times within your calling, there's different positions. I don't believe for me that the grace is still there for me to be like a full-time counselor running a caseload. I have the skills, I have the license and the education to do that, but I don't think there'd be any grace upon it. I don't think I would be a very happy counselor because I feel like that was a season of my life, and that grace for being a counselor is in my past, and now the grace for being a leader and a pastor is what is on me. So I'm still in the same call, but I'm in a different position. So sometimes that transitional grace is positional. He shared also that it was locational. Paul could have resisted the call to plant churches in other locations. As I said, Corinth was his first successful ministry, and he didn't stay there. The grace ended there. It was time for him to leave. Then he went to Ephesus, where there were no believers. What a hard transition that would be, but God's grace was there. And so what was the result? The 6 other churches talked about in Revelation were planted by the church at Ephesus. So when we operate and we receive the grace, you can see that growth happens. God knows what it's doing. So sometimes it's going to go with you in a locational way. He also said it was proportional, that there may be a flow of power beyond what you have seen. Have you ever been in just maybe a natural circumstance in your life where you're like, I have no idea how I had the patience to deal with that. I have no idea how I had the energy or the strength to make it through that. You look back at it now and you're like, that makes no sense to me. There was a proportional grace, and a special portion of grace was working for Paul in Ephesus that he never saw before that and that he didn't see after that. So there are certain situations maybe that you come across in this transition that God gives you like an extra portion of grace when you're on the really bumpy part of the road. And then the last thing he said about this grace that we can have in transition is that it's theological. And I'm like, what? What is he talking about? I had to listen to it over a couple times again. He says, you grow in grace, and as you do, it makes you far better in your theology. And I thought about that for a little bit. He basically said, your understanding of God and your understanding of the Word will grow when you cooperate with grace. I don't ever think I've heard grace taught that way before. I'm like, yeah, I guess when you experience more of his grace and accept more of his grace, you understand more of his character and his nature. You grow in your theology and understanding of the Word. So the first step was take that leap of faith. The second one was learning to understand and accept that transitional grace. Know that God is going to be there with you every step of the way. Step 3 is coming to a place of not my will, but yours. I want to read from Mark 14:36. This is the Passion Translation. This is when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he prayed, Abba, my Father, all things are possible for you. Please don't allow me to drink this cup of suffering. Yet what I want is not important, for I only desire to fulfill your plan for me. A few things that I want us to take away from the passage First of all, this is a passage of transition. First of all, he went to his Abba Father with his struggle. So when you are struggling with change, when you are struggling with transition, the best thing you can do is go to your Father and pour out your heart. The Garden of Gethsemane is where we see this amount of distress on Jesus because he was facing the cross. It says that he sweat blood. And I had heard other people talk about saying that that was possible, and so I wanted to look it up. I'm like, how does this really happen? I don't understand. And it's called, I think this is the right way to say it, hematidrosis. But so I read about it. I'm like, what is this medical condition? It says it's uncommon, but it generally happens when a person feels intense fear or stress. Somebody facing death may have this kind of fear or stress. It's a natural reaction to a perceived threat. It says in rare instances, the response can trigger the rupture of capillaries, which are tiny blood vessels in the body. And this happens because you're in that fight or flight mode, and it's like so intense that your capillaries burst. And a lot of your capillaries are located near sweat glands, so when they burst and the blood exits into the body, then it comes out in the sweat. Imagine the distress. When you are feeling distress in a transition, what's the first thing you do? And I know I could admit I don't always run to God first. I usually find somebody else to complain to first. So we got to get to that point of like, Lord, I'm going to cry out to you in my distress, in my fear, whatever it is, you're going to lay it out. The second thing is we tend to look and ask for alternatives. In the fear and the distress, we seek out other ways to accomplish the mission with less pain, right? Why wouldn't we? I think we stay in this phase sometimes for a long time. We don't want this pain of transition and change, so we try to present plan B, plan C, plan D to God, right? You negotiate with him once in a while. And we look for loopholes. Then we look for scripture to back up plan B, plan C, plan D, and why we shouldn't do this thing. No shame here, we all do it. Why wouldn't we? Because pain is no fun. Pain is no fun. This is like that mental resistance I was talking about earlier, that we're trying to invest every effort possible to find some other way to bring about change. But later in the verse, here's when we really get to this point of transition, which is that psychological piece of change that Jesus prayed. He shared his distress. He says, is there any other way? But then when he gets to the point of saying, not my will, but yours, what I want is not important, for I only desire to fulfill your plan for me. That was the transition. That's the bottom line, most important, where the rubber meets the road part of transition. Really, everything I shared tonight is to help you get to that point when we mentally can say, what I want is not important. Your plan for me is what is important. I will suffer whatever pain and discomfort is necessary because your plan is the best plan. On the other side of that transition is rest. What if each day, in all our decision making, we adopted this attitude? Not what I want, but what you want. Not my will, but your will. How would we treat people differently? How would we view our jobs differently? How would we use our time differently? How would we obey the call differently? When you have this mentality, you won't be so whipped up about loud music, fog machines, or how church ministry is changing. You'll set aside your personal pain for the Great Commission. Will we stop being consumers of church and instead be followers of Christ? I'm going to have Danny come up. Hopefully he's around here listening, to play some keys. And I want to close tonight with us just sitting in the presence for a bit and letting the Lord speak to our hearts on this matter. So much in this past year, I have found how beneficial sitting in His presence can be, so valuable, and yet many of us don't take the opportunity to do it. And so the questions I want you to ask yourself or ask the Lord is maybe where in your life has it been your will and not His? Where have you resisted change and transition? What grace is upon you now, but you're not cooperating with it? Ask the Lord, search your heart. We don't want to be stuck in the past, hanging on to our old ways with a death grip. Not my will, but yours.